Elizabeth married her cousin. Margaret couldn't marry a divorced man. How is that okay? Those aren't rhetorical flourishes. They are the documented facts of what happened, sitting side by side, and the reason they're still being argued about more than 70 years later is that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why one was permitted and the other wasn't. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II were related in two distinct ways. Both were great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, making them third cousins. Both descended from King Christian IX of Denmark, making them second cousins once removed. The Church of England's formal table of kindred and affinity, the official institutional list of relationships prohibited for marriage, made no mention of cousins at any degree. First cousin marriages had been legal in England since the Marriage Act of 1540. Queen Victoria herself had married her first cousin, Prince Albert. Their descendants following suit wasn't a departure from precedent. It was a continuation of it. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, who officiated at Elizabeth's wedding at Westminster Abbey on November 20th, 1947, raised no concern about shared bloodlines. The only religious adjustment required of Philip before the ceremony was his conversion from Greek Orthodoxy to the Church of England, completed in September 1947, not because of who he was related to, because of which denomination he'd been raised in. The cousinhood was entirely unremarkable. Now read the Church's formal doctrine on divorce, as it stood in the same decade. The present law of the Church of England forbids any marriage after divorce. Not discourages, forbids. The Lambeth Conference of 1930 had formally recommended against the solemnization of marriages for divorced persons. The 1948 conference reaffirmed it. This wasn't a private theological frown or a cultural hesitation shared by polite society. It was settled institutional doctrine, with a paper trail going back decades. Two sets of rules, coexisting without apparent embarrassment. One system that cared passionately about whether you had once been married to someone else. One that was completely unbothered by whether you shared great-great-grandparents with your intended. The same institution, the same decade, the same family. That's the structure you need to hold in mind for everything that follows. Princess Margaret Rose was born on 21st August, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the second daughter of Prince Albert and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She arrived 4 years after her sister Elizabeth, and those 4 years were everything. Her father, who became King George VI following Edward VIII's abdication in 1936, adored her. Contemporary observers noted that Princess Margaret does draw all the attention, and Princess Elizabeth lets her do that, a dynamic that ran through their entire childhood and told you something important about both of them. Margaret was vivid, expressive, and magnetically present in any room she entered. Elizabeth was quietly learning to be queen. They were educated privately together, inseparable within their small world, and their father described that world with a phrase that would follow both sisters for the rest of their lives. George VI called his family "We Four," himself, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth, and Margaret, a complete unit, a closed circle, a private world that happened to sit at the center of a public one. The four also included a lesson about what the institution would and wouldn't tolerate. Edward VIII's abdication had been triggered by his intention to marry Wallis Simpson, a divorced American woman. The crown wouldn't bend. The church wouldn't bend. He left. George VI took the throne, and the family that formed around him carried the knowledge from its very formation that the rules around divorce weren't negotiable, that the institution would fracture rather than accommodate them. Margaret grew up inside that lesson without ever being its intended audience. When George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham on the 6th of February 1952, Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II at 25. Margaret was 21. The coronation on the 2nd of June 1953 didn't only crown a queen, it quietly reorganized the institutional map around everyone adjacent to the throne. In July 1953, Parliament amended the Regency Act. The designated regent for the young Prince Charles, a role previously assigned to Margaret, making her the family's second most consequential figure after the Queen, was transferred to Prince Philip, a formal, publicly announced reduction in Margaret's institutional standing, passed by Parliament in the same calendar year the Townsend affair became visible to the public. The newspapers that summer were split between the coronation's pageantry and speculation about the Queen's younger sister. By autumn, Margaret had lost her only significant constitutional role. That is the shape of being the spare in practice. Important enough to carry every protocol and public obligation that came with royal blood, burdened by the visibility and the expectation, but granted no meaningful position, no institutional weight, no advocates inside the system with sufficient power to reshape its rules in her favor. The institution needed Margaret to be royal enough to matter at state occasions. It simply didn't extend that logic to protecting her when the rules became cruel. Her structural position was simultaneously indispensable and expendable. Too high profile to step away unnoticed, too secondary to be protected. Group Captain Peter Townsend is usually introduced as the man Princess Margaret loved, and that framing isn't wrong, but it obscures what made his case institutionally significant. What mattered wasn't the love story. It was what his specific circumstances activated in the machinery of the British state. Townsend was a decorated Battle of Britain pilot. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Distinguished Service Order. He was precisely the sort of man the British establishment had just spent a war celebrating. He was also divorced. Townsend had first met Margaret in 1947 on a 3-month royal tour of South Africa, where he served as equerry to King George VI. The proximity of that role, intimate daily contact with the family across years of shared grief and transition, matters to understanding the relationship's development. The romance deepened in the weeks after the king's death in 1952. On the day of the coronation in June 1953, or shortly after, Margaret was observed brushing lint from Townsend's uniform jacket in full view of the assembled press. The gesture was small and probably instinctive. The speculation it ignited was immediate and international. Churchill's government was in power. The institutional machinery moved quickly. Townsend was transferred to Brussels as air attaché in the summer of 1953, removed from the royal household, separated from Margaret, placed on the continent. The specific cabinet records documenting who made this decision aren't fully accessible in published historical sources, but the outcome is unambiguous. Within weeks of the public story breaking, the decorated war hero was across the channel. And sitting at the head of the government that would ultimately determine Margaret's fate, from April 1955 onwards, was Anthony Eden. Eden had divorced his first wife, Beatrice, in 1950. He had remarried to Clarissa Churchill, Winston Churchill's niece, in 1952. He was, in the precise category that mattered most to church doctrine, a remarried divorcee. When he became prime minister, one of the first tasks that fell to his government was re-engaging with the question of whether Princess Margaret could marry Peter Townsend. A remarried, divorced man, presiding over the institutional refusal to accommodate a princess's marriage to a divorced man on the grounds that divorce was incompatible with the Church's teaching on the sanctity of marriage. Nobody appears to have mentioned this openly at the time. The irony required no commentary then. It requires none now. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required any descendant of George II, male or female, to obtain the sovereign's consent before marrying. Margaret, as George VI's daughter and a descendant of George II, was subject to this act. The Queen's consent was the first gate. The act did provide a partial escape. After turning 25, a royal family member could theoretically marry without the sovereign's consent, provided they gave 12 months' notice to the Privy Council and neither House of Parliament passed an address of disapproval. Margaret turned 25 in August 1955. Parliament could still vote to block her. The entire process required a year of public exposure, and none of it touched the religious obstacle, which existed separately and independently of the legal one. The Church of England's doctrine wasn't the Queen's personal invention. She could no more overrule it than Eden could. The position was formal and documented. Christian marriage was indissoluble. Townsend's previous marriage had existed and legally dissolved. A church ceremony was unavailable for remarriage. A civil marriage was theoretically available, but it carried the explicit weight of the church's disapproval. And Margaret wasn't a private citizen navigating personal choices. She was the Queen's sister. What she did was institutional behavior, watched by the Commonwealth. Documents declassified and released in 2004 from the National Archives revealed that the Queen and Eden had drawn up a plan under which Margaret could marry Townsend while keeping her HRH title and her civil list allowance, confirmed at £6,000 per year. That plan reportedly existed and was discussed at government level. Whether it was clearly and directly communicated to Margaret in terms she could assess as a genuine offer, as opposed to a theoretical possibility circulating in cabinet discussions she wasn't party to, isn't resolved in the historical record. The documents confirm the plan. They don't confirm that Margaret understood it as a concrete, available choice in the weeks before her statement. What we know with certainty is what Margaret herself said on 31st October 1955. The statement, released from Clarence House, read, "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." The language of that statement repays careful attention. Not for its sadness, but for its precision. She knew a civil marriage option existed. She named it explicitly. She described what it would have required, renouncing her rights of succession. She framed her decision as responsive to the Church's teaching and to duty. She didn't say the choice was impossible. She said she had resolved to place duty before it. And this is where the argument splits, and has never fully closed, and probably never will. One reading of that statement is that the terms were impossibly prohibitive. The succession rights Margaret would have renounced weren't merely ceremonial. She was third in line to the throne at the time. Her status as a working royal, her residence, her formal duties, her entire institutional identity was woven into the fabric of what she would have been surrendering. Born into a role she couldn't choose, shaped by an institution she hadn't designed and couldn't reform, she was being asked to dismantle the entire structure of her life in exchange for permission to love one man. That the option technically existed doesn't mean it was meaningfully available. A path with that kind of toll can function as a genuine offer or as the polite language of refusal, depending on how its terms were presented and understood. The Church couldn't be argued with. The Royal Marriages Act couldn't be personally overruled. The tools required to change the rules were held by people who weren't willing to use them. George VI's death in February 1952 had removed the one figure most likely to have argued for accommodation within the family. His absence from the 1953 question, from the specific months when the institutional machinery first moved against Townsend, isn't only a personal loss, but a structural one. There is no certain way to know what a living King George VI would have done, but his death, at that precise moment, removed a potential internal advocate at the exact point one was most needed. The other reading of the 1955 statement looks at the 2004 documents and concludes that Margaret had a real path and declined to take it. The succession rights she would have formally renounced placed her behind the children Elizabeth already had and would continue to have. The HRH title was reportedly secured in the plan the Queen and Eden developed. The civil list income was reportedly confirmed. The gap between giving up everything and giving up the succession position she practically never expected to use is real. And Townsend himself, speaking to the BBC in 1978, expressed no bitterness. He said he was hardly enough to compensate for the losses Margaret would have sustained, meaning he believed she had made the right decision, given what she would have been surrendering, meaning he understood her calculation, meaning the man who stood to gain the most from the marriage thought the terms were genuinely too steep to ask her to accept. That 1978 statement from Townsend is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of evidence in the whole story. He wasn't speaking from resentment. He was speaking from understanding. He didn't describe himself as a man denied love by a cruel institution. He described himself as a man who recognized that what Margaret would have been asked to give up was real, and genuinely weighed against what he could offer in return. He believed, 23 years later, that she had made a rational choice. Whether you find that comforting or heartbreaking probably depends on how you feel about rational choices made under structural coercion. Margaret's own statement doesn't fully resolve this. Mindful of the Church's teaching and conscious of my duty are the language of external constraint, of responding to forces that existed outside and above her. But I have resolved is active, first person, a decision rather than a prohibition. Both readings are simultaneously present in those 29 words. The statement is almost perfectly constructed to sustain both interpretations at once, which is either accidental or deeply intentional. And the historical record can't tell us which. The majority of the British public in 1955 believed Margaret should have been allowed to marry Townsend. The institution was out of step with popular feeling in a way that should have been uncomfortable for it. But institutions aren't democracies, and the Church of England's doctrine on indissolubility wasn't subject to a public vote. The question of whether Margaret was a victim of cruel rules or a woman who ultimately chose the privileges of her position isn't a question that resolves cleanly. Your answer depends on what you believe about the nature of free choice inside coercive systems, about whether options with prohibitive prices attached to them constitute genuine alternatives or sophisticated ultimatums. There's no neutral answer to that. The debate is real on both sides because the evidence on both sides is real. And then there is this. In 2002, the Church of England's General Synod passed a resolution formally permitting the remarriage of divorced persons in church under exceptional circumstances. The rule that had blocked Margaret's marriage, the formal, documented, reaffirmed doctrine that had stood through the Lambeth conferences of 1930 and 1948, through the Coronation and the Regency Act Amendment, and the transfer to Brussels and the 31 words of the Clarence House Statement, was finally, quietly, changed. Princess Margaret died on February 9, 2002, aged 71, following a series of strokes. The Church of England revised its position on remarriage that same year. There is nothing to say about that. The timing is simply what it is. Margaret didn't live to see how completely the world around the rules would change. The Church revised its position the same year she died. Every institutional mechanism that had shaped the 1955 decision was eventually dismantled or reformed. just not in time. 5 years after the Clarence House statement, Margaret had married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a London photographer, at Westminster Abbey on 6 May 1960. He was created Earl of Snowdon upon the marriage. They separated in 1976 and divorced in July 1978, making Margaret the first senior member of the British royal family to divorce since Henry VIII. The woman who had been denied the right to marry a divorced man eventually divorced her own husband. The thing the institution had most feared, a divorced member of the senior royal family, came to pass anyway, through the very marriage it had offered as the responsible alternative. Some stories resolve. This one just accumulates. The crown arrived in 2016, and with it came a generation that had never lived through the original events encountering them for the first time, not as history, but as drama they could feel. 3 actresses played Margaret across 6 seasons, and each of them found something true in her. I met Helena Bonham Carter once, years before The Crown existed. It was brief, unremarkable from the outside. She was sharp and slightly unpredictable, effortlessly herself. And I didn't think about it again until she appeared in Season 3 as Princess Margaret. And something I'd half noticed in that single reel encounter mapped almost perfectly onto what she'd found in the role. It felt retrospectively inevitable, which is the best kind of casting. Vanessa Kirby played the young Margaret in Seasons 1 and 2, covering the Townsend years, the period of the coronation, the affair becoming public, and eventually the 1955 statement. Her performance won a BAFTA Television Award for Best Supporting Actress, and the BBC described her as stealing the spotlight from the main narrative, which is exactly what Margaret herself did in life. Watching Kirby, you understood the institutional problem. She played Margaret as fully alive in a way that made the rules around her feel actively unjust rather than simply procedural. Helena Bonham Carter took over for Seasons 3 and 4. When asked what the character represented after 2 seasons inside it, she said, "In many ways, Margaret is about loneliness. Not rebellion, not glamour, not bitterness. Loneliness." That's the word Craig Brown, who wrote the 2017 biography Ma'am Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, groped towards throughout an entire book structured around the impossibility of fixing her in a single image. Brown described her as simultaneously witty and regal to her friends and rude and demanding to her enemies, someone who had been seen as one of the most glamorous and desirable women in the world in the 1950s and had come to personify disappointment by the time of her death. Both things were true. Loneliness can produce both. Leslie Manville carried Seasons 5 and 6, depicting Margaret's later years, the strokes, the physical diminishment, the gradual narrowing of the world that had always been the structure her identity relied on. Season 6 devoted an entire episode to what reviewers described as a moving exploration of the deep and complicated bond between Margaret and her sister. Manville has spoken about the difficulty of playing a woman who didn't know how to function outside the framework that had both defined and constrained her. That's a precise description of what the institution had built. A person entirely shaped by a system that was simultaneously willing to crush her inside it. All 3 of them played the same woman without making her a victim or a cautionary tale. They played her complicated. The audience understood this instinctively, which is why the debate in the comments sections under every Crown episode covering Margaret still runs hot decades after the real events. You can't watch those performances and arrive at a clean verdict. That's the right response. That's what the facts support. So let's go back to the beginning and place the facts side by side without narration getting in the way. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II were blood relatives through 2 separate dynastic lines. The Church of England's formal Table of Kindred and Affinity contained no prohibition on cousin marriages of any degree. First cousin marriages had been legal in England since 1540. The royal family had practiced cousin marriage going back generations without institutional comment. No church figure raised an objection to Philip and Elizabeth's shared ancestry. The only religious adjustment required of Philip before the 1947 wedding was his conversion to the Church of England in September of that year, not because of consanguinity, but because of denomination. Peter Townsend had been previously married, and that marriage had legally dissolved. The Church of England's formal written doctrine stated that remarriage after divorce was forbidden, confirmed by the Lambeth Conferences of 1930 and 1948. The Prime Minister who presided over the institutional refusal of Margaret's marriage was himself a remarried divorcee. The Church formally changed its position on remarriage in 2002. The rule that blocked the marriage was eventually abandoned, not in time. Two sets of rules, the same institution. One category of relationship caused no alarm whatsoever. The other triggered formal doctrine, government-level intervention, and a parliamentary mechanism that could have overridden a princess's personal choice even after she turned 25. The institution wasn't consistent. It was selective about what it cared about, and the person most directly harmed by that selectivity was the woman with the least institutional power inside it. Whether the selectivity was malicious or simply the product of a system that had never been designed to account for her particular situation, that question is more open. Institutions don't require malice to cause harm. They require only that the rules were written for someone else's circumstances, and that the person most affected lacked the power to rewrite them. George VI had tried to build a world for his family that was immune to the institution's logic. We four meant something. It meant that inside the circle of the family, the rules of monarchy receded, and the rules of ordinary human love were supposed to apply. He had assembled that circle after his brother had been forced to choose between love and the crown, and he had hoped, possibly naively, that his daughters would never be asked to make that choice. Margaret was asked. Her sister carried the weight of watching. The documented record describes the Queen as naturally sympathetic to Margaret's situation. The constitutional reality was that the Queen couldn't simply overrule the Church of England or the Royal Marriages Act without triggering a crisis larger than the one she was trying to avoid. Whether she pushed behind closed doors for a more flexible arrangement, whether she advocated privately and was overruled or ignored, those questions live in the gap between what the documents show and what the rooms contained. The record shows sympathy. The record also shows that Townsend was transferred to Brussels. Margaret died in February 2002. Elizabeth lived for another 20 years. She attended Margaret's funeral and continued. She carried whatever private grief the institution had shaped her to carry privately, for 2 more decades of state business and jubilees and the slow dismantling of the rules that had defined both their lives. She watched 3 of her grandchildren marry for love in ways that would have been constitutionally impossible in 1955. She watched the Royal Marriages Act repealed. She watched the Church amend its position. She outlived the entire architecture of the world that had made Margaret's situation inevitable. When Elizabeth died at Balmoral on the 8th of September 2022, at 96, the 20-year gap between them finally closed. Not in any documentable sense, but in the sense that everyone who has followed this story has always understood it. The institution had separated them, in the specific ways institutions separate people who love each other, and now it had no more power over either of them. They had been we four once, the closed circle George VI had tried to protect. And then there had been a crown, and a set of rules that cared about divorces but not about bloodlines, and a man in a decorated uniform, and the selective moral logic of an establishment that could bless cousins and block a war hero. And then there had been 20 years of Elizabeth continuing alone. Now they were just sisters again, whatever that means, whatever it's worth. The audience that has kept this story alive for 70 years seems to believe it's worth a great deal, and on that specific point, the historical record offers no argument. Was Margaret a victim of an institution that constructed impossibility and called it choice? The 2004 documents, Townsend's own 1978 testimony, and the structural reality of her position all point toward a genuine path that came with genuine costs. Was she a woman who ultimately chose the privileges of her title over the life she might have built elsewhere? Her own statement says she knew the option existed, and she resolved to set it aside. Both things can be true simultaneously in ways that don't fully resolve. The rules were cruel. The rules also offered a path. The path was narrow and steep, and required her to dismantle a life she had not chosen to build. She walked away from it. Whether that was submission or agency or some inextricable tangle of both is the question that keeps this story alive. What isn't debatable? The institution applied its moral framework unevenly. It cared enormously about one category of human relationship and was entirely indifferent to another. It sanctified two cousins and refused a divorcee. And it dressed both positions in the language of sacred principle. Those principles were genuinely held, but their selective application wasn't neutral. It was a choice made by people with power that fell heaviest on the woman inside the institution with the least of it. George VI had hoped we four would be enough to protect her from that. It wasn't. The institution was larger than the family. It always is. If you found this story worth your time, subscribing means more like it.